Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the event. This is the book launch for Underwater, Loss, Flood Insurance, and the Moral Economy of Climate Change in the United States, published in 2020 by Columbia University Press, by my colleague and friend, Dr. Rebecca Elliott, with invited commentary from a panel of speakers and then open discussion with the participants, all of you who are joining us. So this event's hosted by the Department of Sociology at the LSE, and I'm Austin Zeiderman. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environment, and it's a huge pleasure to be chairing the event. You can tweet about the event with the hashtag LSE Climate, so feel free to do so. I'll now introduce the panelists, and then I'll explain the order of the event today. So we'll start off by hearing from Dr. Rebecca Elliott, whose book we're launching this evening. Rebecca is an assistant professor of sociology at the London School of Economics. Her research examines the intersections of environmental change and economic life as they appear across public policy, administrative institutions, and everyday practice, with a particular focus on the governance of climate change. In addition to her academic publishing, she's contributed to Harper's Monthly, the New York Times, and Underwater is her first book. Dr. Daniel Aldana Cohen is assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also directs the Sociospatial Climate Collaborative. He works on the politics of climate change, investigating the intersections of climate change, housing, political economy, social movements, and inequalities of race and class in the United States and in Brazil. He's one of the co-authors of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, and he led the research for the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act introduced in Congress by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Professor Paula Jazarkowski is a professor of strategic management at Cass Business School. Her research has been foundational to the establishment of a strategy as practice approach in studies of complex organizational contexts, including insurance and reinsurance. Her book, Making a Market for Acts of God, provided the first global ethnography of the reinsurance industry. On top of numerous awards and prestigious fellowships, she was recently named a Fellow of the Academy of Management, the first ever Cass Scholar to receive this award. Professor Eric Kleinenberg is the Helen Gould Shepard Professor of Social Science and the Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He's the author of numerous best-selling books, most recently Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life, which was named one of the National Public Radio's best books of 2018. In addition to his scholarship published in academic journals, he has contributed to The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stone, and This American Life. But first, we'll hear from Professor Dana Fisher, one of the series editors for the Society and Environment series at Columbia University Press. She's professor of sociology and the director of the program for Society and the Environment at the University of Maryland. Her research focuses on questions related to democracy, activism, and environmentalism. Her most recent book, American Resistance, which has been cited and discussed widely, is an innovative mixed methods study of protest in the wake of the 2016 US presidential election. She's currently serving as a contributing author for Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Review, writing about civic activism and civic engagement. So turning things over then to Dana, who will give us a few words about the book's place in the series at Columbia University Press. We'll then hear from Rebecca, who will give us an introduction to what the book is about. Then our three additional panelists will give us some reactions, some comments and questions to think with and to engage with the book. And then Rebecca will respond briefly for about 10 minutes, which will give us plenty of time for broader discussion with all of you. Now, a couple notes just about how we're going to do the question and answer period. You can ask questions via the Facebook live stream as comments, but if you don't have a Facebook account, don't worry. Questions can also be submitted via Twitter You can tweet at LSE Sociology, or by email, you can just send an email to sociology.media@lse.ac.uk. Now over to you, Dana.
Thank you so much, Austin. It's wonderful to be here. I'm just here to provide a few quick words about Underwater, and I brought my prop here. I am delighted to see this book out. We, the series editors at Columbia University Press who work on the Society Environment series, were so thrilled to receive this proposal. I personally felt a connection with it, having lived right on the banks of the Delaware River back when I was in New York, and having experienced having to get flood insurance after the experience of a 100-year flood that happened twice in 2 years. So it was really, really heartening to see this academic work that addressed such an important problem. The work does a wonderful job of connecting economic sociology to the politics of loss within the context of climate instability, which is so very important right now. I'll just say that the series for Society and Environment at Columbia University Press, this is part of our inaugural books. We had 2 books that just came out, and the series is expanding now. And Rebecca's book does a wonderful job of helping to set the stage for academic work that's extremely accessible and is appealing to a wide audience. And so I welcome anybody who hasn't yet read the book to get the book, read the book and appreciate it. And anybody who is writing in this area, please consider submitting to our series. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dana. So now we'll turn over to Rebecca Elliott, who will give us an introduction to the book. Rebecca.
Great, thanks, Austin. Thanks very much, Dana. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining. Under different circumstances, this event would have been held in an auditorium somewhere on the LSE campus. There would have been room temperature wine and some salty snacks to follow. And like everyone, yeah, I'm missing convening in person at moments like these, but to me, it is more than an acceptable trade-off to be able to invite not only colleagues, but also friends and family around the world to this book launch. And it's especially exciting to be able to hear from Dana in Maryland, as well as to have this conversation with Eric in New York, Daniel in Philadelphia, and Paula here in London. Thank you all so much for taking the time to read the book and engage with it. Your work has really inspired and informed me. Thanks also to Austin for chairing tonight, and to Maddie Giles, our fabulous events coordinator, who's handled all of the organizational and technical and publicity elements of this. And then thanks, of course, to the Department of Sociology and the LSE and Columbia University Press more generally for all the support. So with the time that I have right now, I want to tell you a little bit about what's in the book, why I wrote it, and what I think different kinds of readers might get from it. So this is a book about loss and climate change. For a while, this has been a big intellectual problem that has preoccupied me. How do we understand, how do we address destabilizing losses that can ruin individuals and communities, losses that some will resist and mourn, losses that are not only financial, but also social and emotional. And my view has come to be that this problem is really at the core of understanding how people will fare in a climate changed US and indeed a climate changed world. But grappling with loss, whether it's related to climate change or not, is not and never has been a purely academic exercise. It's a human fact for all of us. And that's perhaps a pretty banal observation in 2021, in the midst of a deadly pandemic, after a record-breaking year for wildfires and hurricanes and recently extreme cold. All of this is to say that books get written and they get read in particular historical moments. And I just want to begin by acknowledging the enormity of the losses that people have had to contend with, that you may be contending with in this particular moment. So I don't expect that this academic work of sociology will make anyone feel better about loss, but it does look squarely at it. And it does this through a deep dive into the United States National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP for short, which is the public federal program that underwrites flood insurance for homes and small businesses in the US. So the most common first question that I get is, how and why did you come to write a book about flood insurance? By which people are perhaps trying to ask a more polite version of the question, why should I read an entire book about flood insurance? So I'll tell you the story of how and why I wrote the book. And in the process, maybe I'll answer the question that some of you are too polite to ask too. But I wrote Underwater because of a compelling problem that I first saw unfolding in New York City after Hurricane Sandy in 2012. So in the months after the storm, after the floodwaters had receded, after New Yorkers had started to rebuild and repair their homes in order to get back to normal, as people typically do after a storm and a flood, many of them at that point learned that they may no longer be able to afford to insure their homes. So the flood risk maps for the city had been updated, and some of the rules that determine the price of flood insurance had also changed. So these were changes that, taken together, meant annual premiums were set to increase in line with this new updated picture of the risk, and in some cases increase steeply and quickly. So one man in Rockaway, Queens told me that the new flood insurance rate maps and the higher premiums that they were going to make possible were, quote, scarier than another storm. He and others like him were worried about a wave of foreclosures if people couldn't afford to pay the new rates, and who would buy their risky homes if they wanted to sell with these huge flood insurance premiums attached to them. So they could keep their premiums lower by elevating their homes, but this was an expensive proposition, around $100,000 in New York City. So some families had to confront the possibility of being priced out of their homes and their neighborhoods and losing tremendous value on their most important asset, their house, in the process. But at the same time, the losses they were facing were not only things that could be calculated in dollars and cents. They were the loss of a sense of security, a rhythm of life, connections to a community or history, and the stable meanings that root a sense of identity and belonging. All the while, many people had gotten back to normal. They had rebuilt, they'd repaired, leaving them vulnerable and exposed to the next catastrophic flood, which climate science gives us every reason to expect will become a regular fact of life in many parts of the country. And the NFIP was already tens of billions of dollars of debt to the US Treasury, with no reserve to pay claims when the next flood came. So the natural disaster had passed, but in its wake came this economic adjustment, one that was ostensibly about preparing for and securing against flood loss, but which simultaneously seemed to expose people to new possibilities of many different kinds of loss, losses that would be felt unequally. So I followed the story from there, and what unfolded in the years that followed was a period of particularly intense nationwide contestation over what flood insurance fundamentally is, what it should do, and how it will shape the experience of loss as the climate changes. And we may be on the brink of another such period of contestation due to developments just this week, which I'll say more about in a few moments. But the book takes a long view on these controversies. The first empirical chapter begins at the beginning of the NFIP and even before. I draw on archival data from congressional and executive efforts to create the NFIP in the 1960s, which relied on expertise from geographers and economists. And this history reveals the presence of key tensions from the very earliest days of the program's operation. Federal policymakers created this program that was meant to be actuarial, meaning largely risk-based. So in terms of pricing individual policies, that means higher risk, higher premiums. The idea is that this would signal risk and thereby incentivize rational economic calculations that would nudge people away from the water's edge and gradually reduce overall flood losses over time. But at the same time, the program was meant to broadly underwrite, literally, the unequally accessible American dream of homeownership. And high insurance premiums could discourage that, especially in floodplain areas that had already been developed. So premiums needed to therefore be affordable, which might mean lower than risk-based rates. And these tensions are very much still with us today. So the book then follows flood insurance from the halls of Congress in the 1960s onto the streets of New York City many decades later, when residents and local officials had begun to grapple with the threats that climate change poses to American floodplains. Based on interviews and ethnographic observation, I examine what it is that could make a flood map scarier than another storm. And I found that when people encountered flood insurance, they were trying to situate themselves in relation to a plurality of risks and multiple kinds of value, which combined in ways that shaped the decision of what to do next. So would making the house safer by elevating it mean draining a child's college fund or retirement savings? The NFIP rules and maps had changed, but could they change again? And if so, does it make sense to take action right now? And the new maps of flood risk didn't formally take into account climate change, but were they saying something about it anyway? So it was never as simple as a financial calculation based on a flood risk assessment. And the kinds of dilemmas that I was witnessing on the ground in New York City became a national story as it became clear that they were connected to a congressional reform of the flood insurance program that passed just a few months before Hurricane Sandy. By that point, it was also clear that over the decades of its operation, the NFIP had not prevented continued building and habitation of vulnerable areas. There are a lot of people, there's a lot of property in harm's way. So this reform, which was arguably the most substantial reimagining of the program since its founding, sought to shift everyone to more risk-based insurance premiums, in part to put the program on sounder financial footing, given expectations that flood losses would continue to increase due to climate change. So a chapter of the book focuses on this reform and on the ways that different coalitions of environmentalists, taxpayer and libertarian groups, real estate and insurance interests, and homeowners mobilized competing ideas about individual choice, about personal responsibility, fairness, and the deservingness of NFIP policyholders and floodplain residents more broadly, in order to argue for resetting the terms of the program in different ways. The book also unpacks the production of flood maps and insurance premiums, which so often throughout the NFIP's history have been the focal objects of controversy. If you've read anything about flood insurance in the press, it's probably having to do with some of these maps. And I examine these instruments not, as many people do, to make a claim that FEMA gets it wrong or gets it right, claims that in turn depend on an idea of politics as happening separately from or after science. Instead, I tried to show how the choice to include or exclude certain factors and not others from analyses and calculations reflects public policy objectives, often implicit social models, and moral commitments embedded in professions, governance bodies, and the culture at large. So reasonable people can disagree about how to best assess and price risk, and fights about those technical determinations can neither avoid nor definitively resolve this fundamental question of how we ought to live with uncertainty, hazards, catastrophes, and loss. So the controversies that I capture and analyze in the book remain lively. As I mentioned just this week, researchers released a new analysis arguing that in a risk-based rating world, flood insurance rates will have to more than quadruple to keep up with the costs of climate-driven flooding. And the release of that study touched off anxiety about FEMA's plans to launch a new approach to pricing insurance premiums in April, which they're calling Risk Rating 2.0. This approach would further individualize risk assessment, and it could create new and higher premiums for many homeowners. But the price of a flood policy is unavoidably a political question, not a purely technical one, and we should expect a new chapter in this saga to unfold in the coming months. So it may be clear at this point that as I researched the book, the various actors I encountered in the story, homeowners, but also government officials, scientists, engineers, insurance professionals, lawyers, housing advocates, and others could not talk about what is wrong with the NFIP or what needs to be made right without talking about what is fair, prudent, just, deserved, or equitable. Claims about flood maps, about risk classifications, about the price of premiums, even when they're couched in a language of scientific accuracy, as they typically are, also always draw upon a backdrop of normative commitments about what states, markets, and individuals can or ought to do. And this is what I think gives the book its broader stakes. So to me, the NFIP provides an opportunity to think through the moral economy of climate change. And by this, I mean, it's of course a site for witnessing the entanglements of moral ideas and claims with economic arrangements. But in a broader sense, the NFIP participates in shaping the kind of problem that climate change is considered to be, as well as who is responsible for addressing it and how. So from the NFIP, we can appreciate that the thorniest challenges when it comes to the problem of loss are not math problems of balancing premiums in with claims paid out. The thorniest challenges, I argue in the book, are unsettled and unsettling questions of responsibility for loss, justification of loss, and compensation for loss. So the questions about responsibility for loss have to do with disputed understandings of what caused loss, as well as who or what can be held accountable for it, and how insurance frames those determinations. So to what extent is climate change responsible for flood loss today? And if we make that connection, is it then appropriate for a homeowner who purchased a house in a flood zone 20 years ago to bear that cost? Or how much of that cost should they bear? Debates about justification of loss involve contemplation of whether some losses are inevitable or even desirable. Perhaps flood insurance should price people out of risky areas so that they can be returned to nature. Or perhaps this kind of sacrifice is unacceptable or impractical. And whose losses are we talking about? Is this about people losing their only home behind an aging Mississippi River levee, or their second home on the beaches of the Carolinas? Concerns about compensation for loss range from what people in flood zones can fairly expect from taxpayers outside of them, to whether compensation should be making it possible to rebuild homes in harm's way, to the limits of money as a way of addressing the losses that matter to people, what it really means, or whether it's truly possible to be made whole. All of this is to say that when people negotiate the arrangements of insurance, they're trying to sort out what is fair and valuable, what needs protecting, and what should be let go, who deserves assistance in facing loss and on what terms, and whose expectations of future losses are used to govern the present. So if you're the kind of reader who knows a lot about flood insurance, but you're used to thinking only about how it manages our relationship to the water, I hope you'll appreciate this account of how it also manages our relationships to each other. And if you're the kind of reader who knows nothing about flood insurance, I hope this book conveys how massively important insurance is generally for channeling the effects of climate change into the lives of families, communities, and governments. And if you're the kind of reader that wants a new angle of understanding the climate crisis, I hope this book gives you a view into how it intersects with the programs and institutions that we've long been using to manage loss in a political economy that centers property ownership as a strategy for social provision. But no matter what kind of reader you are, I hope the book clarifies some of what is at stake here and the kinds of collective conversations that need to take place if we are to confront loss, our own and that of others, equitably and humanely. Thank you again, all of you, for being here, and I'm excited for the conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm sure all of our participants fall into one of those categories that you just mentioned. So hopefully they'll all be clicking purchase on the book as we speak. So now, thank you, Rebecca, for that overview and that introduction and that entry into our panel discussion now. So we have 3 additional panelists who we've invited to come and share some reactions, some comments, some questions. And they'll take about 10 minutes or so each. And we'll start off with Daniel Aldana Cohen. Daniel.
Great, thank you. It's so exciting to be here. And Rebecca, first of all, just congratulations on an extraordinary book. This will be talked about for a very long time. If you're in the category of reader who hasn't bought the book yet, then change categories. Sometimes you have to change the category that you're in expeditiously. So this is a really, really, really great book. And I'm gonna just offer a few reactions and then some questions. I come to it sort of as a political sociologist who's thinking in particular about the politics of climate change and the ways that people mobilize around it. Before delving into that, I think I first want to just sort of set the scene again, echoing some of the themes that Rebecca has just laid out. We live in a world where we're told that markets are the most efficient and effective way to get anything done. And in that world, we are very often told by powerful people that the problem with climate change is that it hasn't been adequately integrated into markets, that we don't have the prices right, but that if we can get the prices right, for example, if wise bureaucrats can figure out how to price risks of climate change, carbon dioxide, you name it, then that will kind of get fed into the market as a system for allocating scarce resources efficiently and effectively. And then we will get, our cake and eat it too, which is a happy liberal market economy where everybody's doing great and there's no waste and no red tape. And not only do we live in that world, which is, full of fantasies, obviously, but we particularly live in a world in climate politics where we've been told that the insurance industry in particular is going to be this kind of magic actor. Because what we've been told is that insurers have a major economic stake in preventing climate losses from destroying their bottom line. And that then, in fact, not that just the insurers, but the insurers of the insurers, the reinsurers, are them going to step in. And every year we get told, next year it's coming. Next year, the reinsurers are going to step in. They're going to bring the adults together in the room, bang their heads together and sort everything out. And I think one of the just clear, major, overwhelming benefits of this book is just giving us a lot of reasons to understand why that idea is so naive, not just because we kind of disagree with it on normative grounds or have suspicions, but we just go through and see how this insurance program that was set up to essentially like engineer behavior around a more intelligent appreciation of risk just falls apart at every major point of contact. So I think this book is really a devastating attack on the idea that if we just get the prices right, then the market will essentially go back to normal. Rebecca doesn't take on the full big market question at length, but the portrait of the insurance industry as an exemplification of this market framework and why it doesn't work, the book really, really excels in that. So I would add that kind of category of potential readers. If you're interested in the basic question of market and climate, you need to read this book. So among the many problems here that the book illustrates is that there's actually far from obvious how you would improve prices. Mapping climate risk is really hard. It's very difficult to simply map how vulnerable an area is to a flood, even if there were no climate change. Urban terrain is not just like a bathtub or something like that. It's not like a plane, it's not like a cutting board. Different kinds of urban environments interact with the water in different ways. Then it gets even harder if we're talking about the risk of future flooding, because not only do we not know how much carbon will go into the atmosphere, but that's not even the only source of sea level rise in places like the Northeast. There's also sinking land, there are gravitational forces, ocean circulation, you name it. So just even being able to come up with a consensus on how at risk any given square foot is for flooding is extremely difficult. And what that means, and as this book shows in great detail, when government agencies start putting out maps that change prices based on potential flood risk, people freak out and you have a massive amount of disagreement. And it is totally hopeless to imagine that there will ever be a consensus discussion of risk. And it's not a case where if you just had, let's say, the technical experts in the room, they could ever sort this out. There's always going to be a giant error bar on any of those determinations, but your flood insurance isn't going to have an error bar of plus or minus $100 every month. It's just going to be $1 amount. It's going to have a massive impact on your entire financial future and on the financial future of your entire community. So the book shows in very specific detail how kind of hopeless the idea of getting the prices right actually is, and why that's such a problematic form of climate governance. And we could go on. There's issues of affordability. There's issues of like incumbency. Are you suddenly going to get told you bought a house that didn't have flood risk? Now it does. Suddenly your insurance cost is extra hundreds of dollars a month. You have to raise your house multiple feet. You have cases after Hurricane Sandy that Rebecca talks about, where families have raised their house 6 feet, then they come and get told, actually, maybe it had to be an extra 2 feet. That's an extra $100,000 right off the top. So it's kind of mind blowing. And I think, most of us, most humans, I think on this call don't live in properties on the shore. And so even to me, who I think I'm pretty familiar with this topic, was actually blown away at just how visceral this stuff is. And actually these stories probably are not widely told enough. Now, I think that's important. In addition to all this, these are important issues, because I think what Rebecca is saying here is that it's not just about the difficulty of getting the price right, though. Let's say one could. It's also that there is just a fundamental incommensurability between what this quantification is trying to do and what we care about in the world. I think it's not so much a question of you can't get the price right, or it's very difficult to get the price right. I think for Rebecca, the very effort to quantify climate risk and to put prices on it is just in violent conflict with non-quantifiable aspects of social life, which could include values, could include our hopes and dreams, could include our social relations, and Marxian language would include essentially use values as opposed to exchange values. Rebecca talks about how the idea, the losses that people confront overflow the bounds of, or the narrow bonds of calculation, alluding to, of course, Michel Cohen. And again, and this gets twisted into the economy to the point that, Rebecca talks to people who tell her that the new flood maps, which raise the cost of insurance to make their homes unaffordable, the new flood maps put out by the US government are actually worse than Hurricane Sandy itself. So you have this kind of intermixing of loss, fear, price, cost, and all of this is sort of unbearable for people. And the fundamental problem, again, is just the violence of quantification. So Rebecca uses the concept of moral economy to help us think through all of this. And I'm not going to provide a summary of the moral economy concept because Rebecca wrote the book, not me. But I think the moral economy concept is helpful. And as Rebecca lays out in the introduction, it helps us understand why people get often so angry. And I think if I understand right, people get very angry when a set of economic relations that they consider to be more or less okay get disrupted in ways they consider fundamentally unfair. Like if I'm living in a home and I can barely get by month to month, it is just unfair if a bureaucrat comes in and says, well, we did some calculations and now you owe us an extra $400 a month. It's just not fair. And so people freak out. And this is, I think, a very productive way to think about how people deal with climate politics. It's a really productive framework for thinking about the Gilets jaunes in France. It's a productive framework for thinking about the Tea Party in the United States, right? People having a certain set of basically acceptable relations that they live in, and then those feel arbitrarily transformed in ways that feel unbearable, and people freak out and they get very angry. And that anger is not just a reaction, but it then produces a whole set of politics. And a lot of what this book is about the ways that people, in reaction to the flood maps that come after Hurricane Sandy, but they would have come actually anyways, but they end up coming to a large part after Hurricane Sandy, people freak out, and this ends up producing a whole bunch of politics. So this disjuncture between quantification and human values and relations is not just an abstraction, it's not just a form of everyday living, but it is productive of major political projects. So with that backdrop, I have 3 questions for you, Rebecca. I'm not sure if you'll be able to get to them all, but hopefully we can talk about them in the years ahead. The first question is, can you help us sort of understand more clearly what are the conditions where that reaction to unfairness, to the upset of the moral economy produce fundamentally negative rage? So the Stop FEMA Now coalition, or we can think about the Tea Party or the Gilets jaunes. What are the conditions where that rage actually gets channeled into something that we might consider more positive? Everyone here should know, I love the Green New Deal. Rebecca called for it in 2017 after Hurricane Harvey. So Rebecca, you have a concept of when people after disaster maybe should ask for not just a rejection of a prevailing system or an adjustment to that system, but should ask for like a totally different system of social provision. And I would love to hear you speak a little bit on what are the organizing conditions or the political economic conditions necessary for that reaction that's not a fair solution to actually turn into a positive campaign and not just the negative one, which is like, don't change those things because it's worse if you change them. So from negative to positive. The second question is, and it's related to when do people exceed the boundaries of the market framework or when do they not? So this is really a book about homeowners, but you point out a number of times that public housing residents, other low-income tenants, they really get nothing at all from the system of flood insurance. They're actually arguably the most at risk. And often these people appear when you're in the Rockaways, a very vulnerable part of New York City. And so I wonder, when you see people who are getting screwed by a form of the market, are not just saying, wait, that is the wrong way to deal with this market, but instead saying, actually, my solidarities are with people who are even outside that system entirely, people who aren't even homeowners and in many ways are even more screwed. And then third, this is my kind of like effort at a head exploding emoji question. The market is supposed to be a system that allocates resources efficiently through essentially quantification. And that's obviously not working in this story. To what extent is the problem of quantification? To what extent is this a story about scarcity or market naturalized scarcity? In other words, it's not necessarily the case that it's hard to find decent housing in a modern capitalist economy, right? You have the revival of social housing in particular in the United Kingdom, but all across Europe. So is this, I mean, I wonder to what extent this is about the violence of pricing, to what extent this is about the imposed scarcity of just good options for living well in a community and with stability and with economic security. And so it's of course still the market, but now we might emphasize less the quantification in isolation and think more about quantification in its like fundamental relationship to the idea of scarcity, which is just as important to sort of neoclassical economics fundamental understanding of what it is about. So having thrown all those crazy thought grenades, I will now pass it on. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Daniel. So collecting questions as we go, and Rebecca, just a reminder, we'll have a chance to think through some of those questions and give some responses after our three panelists. So our next panelist is Paula Jazarkowski, and she'll also offer her reading of the book and propose a few other questions for Rebecca to work with.
Okay, so I'm gonna share screen and, just, it wouldn't be the same if there wasn't a PowerPoint at least once in a presentation. And I want to celebrate this book. I want to say bravo, Rebecca, because you've shed light on something that is incredibly important and only getting more important. So first thing to say is you should read this book because it's actually talking about the world that we're all living in right now, and it is affecting us. Whether you live on a shore or a coastline, you are affected by this. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of a reason to understand why you are affected by this. Even if you didn't care for the people that Rebecca writes about, you should care about this because it's going to hit you in your pocket and it's going to hit you in, your social economy as well. So I think that I just want to put Rebecca's book in the context of, I'm a person who studies insurance. I actually love studying insurance. So that's a pretty small subset of us who can say that and say it with meaning. But I think if you read Rebecca's book, you'll understand why you too could love studying insurance, because it is so fundamental to the way we think about the world and the risks that we're dealing with. So I want to put Rebecca's book in this wider context. She shines a spotlight on one aspect of a much bigger problem. So the first thing I just want to put out there is that extreme weather events have doubled in the last 20 years. And when you think about 6,681 events, that's a lot of events. That's a lot of people being hit by something. Maybe not a flood, maybe not as something as catastrophic as the Australian bushfires or the Californian wildfires in the last sort of not even 15 months. But the cost of that is an enormous global economic loss. And this is always how we report on these things, the enormous global economic loss. But an economic loss can never be an economic loss absent of a social loss as well. Okay, we lose communities. Some of the research that FEMA itself has done has showed that 45% of small businesses, the little things that people start, never come back after a disaster. So we're talking about a fundamental decimation of communities and of society. When we talk about these things, they're not just a big number, although I reckon that's a pretty big and scary number, but they're also an important social consequence. Now, I want to put that number there alongside the point that Rebecca is raising in her book about insurance. And so one of the ways that we have traditionally thought we were protected against these losses or paid for these losses, although that has never been complete, is through insurance. But insurance has been changing a lot. So as the risks, as the risks got riskier, which is my top point there, at the same time, the insurance got better at calculating. And so what risk reflexive pricing is it's a statement that says, we can now drill down, we have the science to calculate what is the most risky part. You know, we can construct these maps that Rebecca and indeed Daniel talked about, and we can say, what is the most risky part? And we can say, well, if that's the most risky, then that's the one that should pay the most. And that kind of makes intuitive sense, right? It even sounds fair. If you cost more, then you should pay more. And we can point that down to very small parts of, you know, not just postcodes, but specific houses in specific places on a street and how much they do or don't flood. So we can say, and this is in fact a sound principle, a sound actuarial principle of insurance, that under risk reflexive pricing, those that cost more are those that should pay more. Now, obviously that raises for me some problems immediately, because it says that if it costs more, I should pay more. That means I'm somehow responsible or able to mitigate against that in a way that means I could pay less. Okay, because that can be the only sensible attribution of meaning in my world, which is if it costs you more, you pay more, which means you can do something about it to stop it costing you more. But actually, when we think about climate change, I mean, who is responsible for the Australian bushfires? Who is responsible for the pictures that we are seeing in the UK? I'm living in London. I'm in central London right now. We have seen so much of all of this already this year, and we're not even at the end of our second month, and we're seeing flooding like this. Now, Rebecca positions this problem of the risks are getting riskier, the prices are getting higher and also more specific, alongside something that came up in response to what is usually called market failure. Okay, so some problem where the market can't handle the risk, and we get the rise of these subsidized government legislated insurance schemes. She's looked at the NIFIP one, which has a long and indeed troubled or conflicted history. But, you know, here in the UK, we have Flood Re, a much more recent eventuality, but these things exist all around the world, and they are increasingly being considered as one of the ways that we're going to try and manage this growth in risk. And, you know, in my world, or the work I do, we call these uneasy truces, because they're always got shifting parts. And the point is, these things weren't necessarily brought about to handle my top line here, which is this rapid increase in events. They were maybe some response to the affordability of insurance and the problem of risk reflexive pricing, but they have been hit with this double whammy of trying to work out how do you subsidize the losses of the few from the premiums of the many, when increasingly we're seeing the losses of the many and from a relatively modest set of premiums. And so I think that she's really hit the nail on the head of a very important thing that we have taken for granted as a form of societal and economic protection, which is the insurance market. And the reason you need to read this book, why it deserves your close attention, is because of the way that Rebecca has studied this. She hasn't taken as a fact the nature of, you know, well, it's climate change, or we can actuarially price that, or we can come up, you know, or even we can set up a pool and a pool will fix that. Because actually what she takes us into is the meaning systems of the people living inside this. The particular approach that Rebecca has taken is very important to me, because these are not abstract numbers. This is, you know, when you read the very first vignette or in Rebecca's book, it's about Palmer Doyle, who is just confused about what he can possibly do. He's been flooded. His flood insurance premiums have risen enormously. You can't keep your mortgage if you don't have flood insurance. Okay, mortgage and flood insurance, they go together. That's gone up enormously. It's some sort of mythology that if you could just reconstruct your house in some way, then you would be able to afford these premiums. Can you afford to reconstruct your house? How do you know what is the right way to reconstruct your house? Have any of you actually lived in a house while it is being reconstructed? I mean, we are making enormous asks of these human beings who are just like you and me, you know, sitting in houses, hoping that they are safe as houses in whatever they've invested in as their livelihood. And so how can you not be moved by Palmer Doyle, who is underwater in every way, both in terms of the flood, but underwater in terms of what this has done to his asset base and to the way he thinks about his future? And indeed, the answer, which could be, well, why don't we move the Palmer Doyles? Can we move Palmer Doyle and his family and his friends and everybody in their community somewhere else? Because when we move the Palmer Doyles, we move them out of their community. We take them away from their sense of space and place. And okay, maybe it stops them getting flooded, but it's still not an easy solution. It's an uneasy solution for real people. And I think that this is what Rebecca does. She turns the sociological eye on insurance, and she says this is not just a calculative device. It sits at the nexus of these past reflections of what we understood about risk to calculate future payments for losses that we really don't understand when you look at that first figure I put up on the previous slide of how much events are increasing. And they're increasing all around the world. Like I said, you don't have to be the person on the coast in New York or indeed in Florida to be affected by this, because you are being affected by this because it all gets paid from the same global wallet. And then she raises questions about when we make these decisions based on insurance and pricing, we are making decisions about how you attribute responsibility. And who is responsible for this? Is Palmer Doyle responsible for this because, you know, somehow he ended up somewhere 25 years later on a floodplain? And so the value of the eye that Rebecca brings is on bringing this interpretive lens of the everyday meaning systems that the people living with this, the insurers, the environmental agencies, and the people just trying to own a house and make a living, and how they attribute meanings to risk, to responsibility, and to price, and indeed the very different power balances between those people in how we decide who's responsible. Is it the individual living at that waterfront, or is it the collective society? And how should we negotiate that set of things between markets and between sort of a social responsibility for the protection of people in society? So I think this is a really important book. It doesn't come up with naive answers. It's not trivializing or cheapening you by saying there is an easy answer, because there isn't one. But what I would like to ask Rebecca is, why is it so important that we turn a social science eye, not just an actuarial eye, but a social science eye on these issues of climate change and insurance? What is it that we're going to see? And while I know that you're not offering these solutions, is there a way that might enable us to act differently? And secondly, and I think these two questions are related, I mean, one of the reasons insurance isn't boring for the Rebeccas of this world, or indeed many of us, for myself, is when you go and live with people, and that includes insurers and actuaries, and you watch the meanings they are bringing to their doing, you cannot help but be impressed by the sincerity of all of these people who are acting within a meaning system that is right for them. Of course, those meaning systems don't all align. So I'd like to ask a little bit more about what are the benefits of bringing this ethnographic approach to the study of these issues. And so on that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm just going to say one more time, brava, Rebecca, for focusing us on such an important issue.
Great, thanks so much, Paula. Well, whether insurance is boring or not, certainly you and Rebecca and our whole panelists make it interesting to all of us. So thanks so much for that. We'll turn now to our third panelist to offer his reading and his comments and questions on the book, and that's Eric Kleinenberg. Eric.
Great, thank you. I'm voting that insurance is boring. I want to be clear about that. It's completely boring. And it really is an amazing accomplishment of this book that Rebecca makes it totally riveting and even necessary. When you're reading the book, you feel like you're reading something urgent that you need to understand, that's worth thinking hard to puzzle over. And that is a feat of the sociological imagination. It's a feat to Rebecca's intelligence and creativity. And I guess I want to say, because I think it's really worth emphasizing, that this is an extraordinary book. I would say that this is easily one of the most interesting and original works on climate change that I've read in the last decade. There are a lot of books about climate change now. There's one coming every Tuesday. and everyone has a big idea about it. And if you follow this literature well, it gets a little bit boring, let's be honest. And we can only be warned so many times about things that we all know are coming if we live in the science-based world. It is not easy to write an original book with new and provocative and difficult ideas. And Rebecca has done that. This is a book about climate change for grown-ups. It's not sugarcoating the story, and it's not scaring everyone into thinking that they need to act because the flood is coming. It's instead trying to help us think through the most difficult and thorny human problems and systemic problems and material problems that climate change introduces for us. It's a book that reflects Rebecca's work over the last decade, telling us that we need to understand, not just how to change our work for climate change, but also how climate change changes our work and our lives and our ways of being. And I just think what's so exciting about this book, and what made me say yes to a Zoom call that I would otherwise want to avoid, because who needs another Zoom call in life, is that it is very clear that Rebecca is one of the most important and original voices that we have in this incredibly important debate about climate change and what it means for all of us. And for those of you who are not here because Rebecca's mother made you come, you really want to follow Rebecca's work as closely as you can. Even if you're Rebecca's mom's friend, you want to follow Rebecca's work as closely as you can. This is just important stuff, and you're not going to find it a voice as important as Rebecca's very easily. Let's pause for a second to think about this, the concept of the title. Underwater. What a powerful idea that organizes our thinking about this problem. It tells us something about our planet and what's happening as sea levels rise. It tells us something about the places where we've settled, the cities and the coastal areas that once seemed like they were relatively secure, stable places to break ground, and now suddenly seem like they are falling apart. Our infrastructure, which was built for a world that was drier and higher and cooler, which now suddenly is itself underwater. The structures where we live, the houses that are the subject of this insurance that you've now heard so much about, our investments. It's not the house that's underwater. This language of the home being underwater and of that having everything to do with your economic fortune and your economic security and your capacity to stop working or to stay going in difficult times. Clearly, the title is about that. It is about a market society and an orientation to social organization that held water for several decades around the world, and it is now increasingly being questioned because it looks like the model doesn't work, right? And we've heard a lot about how the model doesn't work from previous commentators. Maybe it's even about what it means to live in a enlightened democracy, in a place that's, as Paula just said, where everyone is kind of trying to act virtuously and do good using the meaning systems that are legitimate and not getting us out of the problem anyway. The book registers on all of these levels and is a real feat. So, what's at stake here is the question of how climate change hits the ground. This is why it's a work of sociology and sociologically important. Climate change is often an abstract idea. It once pointed to a future that we had to imagine. Much of the writing about climate change is anticipatory. We forecast a world that's coming and think about what it means to adjust to it. This is a book about climate change, not as something we anticipate, but as something that we are reckoning with, even though these issues about flood insurance are not really future-based. They're here and now. And one can say too that there are a bunch of abstract issues we deal with around economic modeling and risk assessment and flood mapping. These all become real in specific and loaded moments. And Rebecca's book shows what happens when they lash up in the American insurance market all at once. It brings them together in a powerful way. So what's at stake in her book? What's at stake in the issues she addresses? Nothing short of questions like, where can we live? Where can we live and where can we not live? What is the value of the places we live? How much is it worth to live in some place? Are the costs changing? What are the costs of being where we are? Can we afford to stay there? What happens to us and where would we go if we decide we can't stay any longer, or the market tells us we can't stay any longer, or the state gets out of the business of subsidizing our protection so we can't stay any longer? Does it matter who moves in if we leave? There's a community in Staten Island that Rebecca writes about. People are facing recurrent flooding, and the government says to them, listen, we'd like to help to bail you out. We want to help you with managed retreat. This is a subject of a book by Rebecca's good friend and colleague, Liz Kozlov. And a community has to face a question of whether they should take buyouts. But it turns out whether you're going to leave hinges on what's going to happen to the land after. What if we marketized insurance and got rid of state subsidies and said, the only people who should live by the coast are people who can really afford to deal with the consequences of flooding, and those people turn out to be very wealthy. And so what we do by marketizing is we turn the coast over to only the most affluent people. And if the deal is you should leave your home so that more affluent people can come and build higher, better places that are more resilient, to use a word everyone loves, that's a different kind of deal than you should leave and we should turn this land over to Mother Nature and have it become natural infrastructure because no one should live there. And there are real consequences to the way that we establish programming around those kinds of things. Who else is in our situation, Rebecca asks us to consider. Is it possible to build a new politics, new forms of solidarity around the fact that we share a similar kind of vulnerability? Is climate change and rising seas and the economic dislocation that comes from that precisely the kind of thing that could shake up our sense of who we are, our sense of the way we identify, our notion of what group we belong to, what kinds of causes we want to take seriously? What happens when a group of right-wingers finds itself so close to the sea, so clearly in harm's way that suddenly climate change, which they're not supposed to believe in, seems real, and state buyouts and subsidies, seem urgent. Should the government subsidize insurance for people who live on the water? Kind of depends on who they are. And Rebecca forces us to think seriously about this. If we imagine this as the kind of issue for, very wealthy people with second homes, beach homes in affluent communities, we think about it in very different terms than we do if we imagine, towns that started as fishing communities or places for people who work on the docks, or in all the industrial areas that we located near the water, because then we could dump waste there, right? And so the way we conceive of this set of issues comes up in Rebecca's book, and she urges us to think carefully about all the kinds of dilemmas that are here. There are no right answers, of course, to any of these questions. There's no right way to do things. And this is why the kind of moral economy approach that Rebecca takes is so productive, because she shows that when we talk about insurance, when we establish policies to support things with state subsidies or to bring things into the market and let insurance companies decide how to do it on their own, when we make those decisions, what we're really doing is showing who we are and what we value. We're establishing what we think needs to be protected. And intriguingly, she says, when we establish, what it is that we need to protect, we're also introducing other kinds of questions. Like when we lose something, we're doing it so that other things can be sustained. What things are we trying to sustain, right? And how can sociology help us to think about that? So let me wrap up by asking for something from Rebecca, who has already given us so much. Your intellectual project for the last several years has been to help us think more seriously about loss and what it means, and how we think about what we lose and what we potentially gain as we move into this new moment, as the Holocene disappears and we move into the destabilized world of the Anthropocene. I really want to ask you to say more about this and to tell us, how we should think about loss and what it means for the way that we study the world and make sense of the world. And I also want to ask you what we need to do as social scientists trying to reckon with climate change. Do we need to be more oriented toward the built environment and the physical environment? Is climate change forcing us to take the material world more seriously, to treat it with a different level of concern than we have in the past? Sociology and the social sciences spent years trying to reckon with the fact of our embodiment. Do we now also have to reckon with the fact that our bodies are located in places and that the fate of those places as physical systems matters more than we cared to think? We don't just belong to a social system, as Durkheim wanted us to see. We also belong to an ecosystem that we can't do social science without. I'm going to stop there. Rebecca, congratulations. Thank you so much for including me in this.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric. I started to count the questions that you were asking, and you asked so many questions, but luckily they weren't for all of us. Those were for all of us. They weren't for Rebecca to answer specifically, but those are the kinds of questions that Rebecca's book is generating. So, and Eric has really laid those out for us. Rebecca, you do have a lot of questions here on your plate, and as usual, they're probably more than you can or want to deal with at the moment. Some you'll probably keep thinking about. But why don't we turn things over to you now and allow you to give a response. Just as you're kind of collecting thoughts on that, it seemed to me that there were sort of three groupings of questions, and maybe that's helpful. One was about kind of the politics and the action, right? And we heard questions both from Daniel and from Paula about that. Another one was about sort of the model, right? The model of risk, the model of insurance, and thinking about quantification and calculation and kind of the market and scarcity, questions around the sort of model itself. And the third one might be about kind of how we as social scientists interact with all these questions, right? And those have to do with more of our methods and our theories. And it seemed that kind of questions were cutting across from our three panelists, sort of those three groupings of the politics, the action, the model, and then kind of the methods and the theories that we use. So thought I would kind of throw that out there in case you want to use that as a guide for responding, but we just look forward to hearing your responses. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you for these really, for the very kind words, but really also for all of these kind of questions and provocations. I mean, the danger here is that you've made me feel like I could write a second book about flood insurance, but I don't plan to. But it suggests that there might be more here to mine. I will keep it brief because I am keen to leave time for other folks to ask questions who might be interested. But to start with this question that Daniel raised about the politics of this and the kinds of different ways that people get mad about things that seem unfair. I don't have the kind of falsifiable sociological model for the conditions under which one versus the other obtains. But maybe the first thing I'll say is that I think both kinds of politics, both a kind of reactive negative politics and a more positive or reconstructive politics, I think those are always going to coexist because, at the core, they're both animated by this awareness that the status quo is on shaky ground. And people vary in their attachment to that status quo, as well as, of course, how much they benefit from it. When we're talking about the kinds of threats to homeownership in the particular political economy that we have in the United States, we're talking about the erosion of a lot of historically accrued privilege. And if you don't have a stake in that kind of material and social order, then I think, in some ways you're more open to a kind of reconstructive politics because, what have you got to lose? It's a different story for you. The normal isn't working in quite the way that it seemed to be working for some people for a long time. And I think if we want to think about explaining which register of claims resonates, I think loss is at the core of that as well, because it's a question of how people get organized around ruined landscapes, ruined lives, ruined livelihoods. In the reactive case, it's really a question of the loss of property and what that means for people. But in the case of something like the Green New Deal, the claim isn't that we shouldn't be worried about what the loss of property is going to do to people, because that's real. It's rather a set of politics that tries to be a little bit clearer about the problems that we need to solve. One is housing, whether you own it or not, that we want people to have safe and affordable housing. And the other is all of the kind of economic security that property ownership proxies for in the US today. So that's kind of my thinking about the politics of how those two things might intersect. And then to Paula's questions about insurance, in some ways, what I think insurance allows us to think about is, Tom Baker, who's a legal scholar, wrote about insurance as a kind of material constitution for society. Like, you can learn so much about any given kind of social or cultural context by looking at the ways that it insures things and people and risks, who's inside and outside of the boundaries of risk pools and so forth. And I think in this moment, as we face climate change, the question of the social contract is really the fundamental question. And insurance is, I think, a site where you see some of this complexity playing out, and particularly around the issue that Paula's comments pointed us to about the kind of dynamic and ambiguous relationship between public and private. That, in the situation we have in California right now, does not look terribly dissimilar to the situation that led to the creation of the National Flood Insurance Program, where after catastrophic losses, you had private insurers who raised premiums or who pulled out of markets or who kind of scaled back the protection that they would offer or refused to renew policies. And those homeowners are then left to take advantage of a California public state plan, which is a very kind of basic level of protection. And what I think we see here is a story where you have a kind of split, Paula has talked about, and others, Lee Johnson has talked about, as a protection gap, where people have access to kind of different kinds of protection based on what they can buy. And I think, these issues of kind of what are the limits of what markets will do, what are the limits of what states will do, and how do individuals kind of fare in the midst of all that, I think is a really important one for thinking about what climate change is going to look like as a kind of economic reality for folks. And methodologically, I think you need the ethnographies, you need the interviews, you need the archival data to uncover some of the dilemmas. And you need to know what the dilemmas are in order to understand what people are fighting about, and in turn, how those fights shape the way insurance actually works in practice. It's all well and good to kind of say, here's our model of what will happen if you raise premiums in terms of take-up rates, or here's what different views of the risk look like, and these are the implications. But all of those kind of facts and all of those analyses have a social life where, people have feelings about them, and then they make claims about them, and then they shape whether or not they can really be used. And then, to Eric's questions about loss, my interest in loss really came from starting from the premise that the climate crisis is here. So as Eric pointed out, a kind of frustration that a lot of the writing was anticipatory and was thinking about the future and focused really on, do people believe in climate change or not? And that's all important work. That's work that we should still do, and we should still care about whether or not people believe in climate change. But I think there's also this whole terrain of space to consider what climate change is already doing, and what it's already doing is creating losses of various kinds. And that's not to suggest that climate change drives loss in some deterministic fashion, because what we can do as sociologists is examine the ways that we actively shape those losses in the present. We shape what is lost, on what timeline, with what effects, and for whom. And that, to me, I think is a really important space where sociology and social science more generally should be focusing. And there's also a political reason to think about loss. I mean, I situate it as a kind of melancholy inverse to thinking about sustainability, which is the kind of more common register for thinking about climate change or environmental change more broadly. And and that's and thinking, but I think if you're clear about what is being lost or will be lost or might be lost or should be lost, I think that actually opens the space to think more clearly about what might replace it. And in a context where I think what we need are some pretty fundamental transformations, I think loss gets us there better than a discourse of sustainability does. And with that, I would like to turn it over to other questions.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. That does give us a lot to think about, and also to transition into some questions as our viewers, as our audience are starting to compile their thoughts and to send them over to us. I wanted to add just a question of my own, which sort of follows on something Eric said, just about how much is written about climate change these days. It's hard to write about society, environment, really without taking it into account. A lot is written about disaster too. And I was wondering, outside of the kind of academic space, what you think we should be reading that is important for us to really be thinking these days. And I'm thinking not just contemporary stuff, but older stuff as well. And one thing I've been reading recently, just to throw it out there, is Richard Wright's essay, Down by the Riverside. He wrote it in 1938. It's about the 1927 Mississippi flood, huge disastrous flood. And it's really a profound kind of short novel on loss, profound and poignant loss of all kinds. And I found that essay in particular quite important to kind of think through a lot of the questions that we're discussing here. So I was just curious, what inspires you outside of the kind of academic analysis of climate change, disaster, risk, insurance, et cetera? Are there other things that you'd recommend that we should be reading?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think, my favorite writing, a lot of it is essays and journalism on climate change. I mean, some of the work by Mary Heglar is incredibly poignant, and her work in all of her writing and speaking, she does a tremendous job of kind of situating some of these concerns in much longer histories and being attentive to the ways that when we talk about climate change as an existential threat, we, as though, it's the first or only existential threat, we're invisibilizing histories of existential threats that have faced kind of multiply marginalized and oppressed people throughout history. And so when we want to think about strategies of resistance and survival, we have histories of that. This is also a work, it is a work of history, and it's an academic book, but work by Nick Estes on much the same topic, kind of recovering, for those of us who didn't have to learn it in school, the kind of history of indigenous resistance and the lessons we might learn about that in terms of transforming into something new and better in a climate change world.
Great, thanks. They're just building up kind of recommendations for a reading list that, of course, Rebecca's book is at the top of. So just a few other kind of things to think with. But we do have some questions coming in from the audience now. And so I want to start off with a question from Andy Horowitz. Now, Andy asks, I'm curious to hear you on Naomi Klein's claim that the climate crisis, quote, changes everything. As a sociologist, how do you understand the challenges upon us? Are they truly without precedent or new iterations of enduring problems? It follows a bit on what you were just starting to talk through there.
Yes, hi, Andy, and thank you for the question. This is actually something that I'm thinking specifically about right now in new work, where I'm thinking about what I'm calling the problem of incumbency as it relates to climate change. This idea that the common way of thinking about climate change is about transformation and that it's going to change everything, but that a lot of social work is ongoing to keep as much the same as possible. And we see that reflected in the kind of market-based approaches to climate change mitigation, but also in the building of infrastructure that's going to protect kind of existing settlements of people and property so that they don't have to change, so that climate change won't change them in ways that we don't want them to. So, I think as sociologists, we have to be, or historians too, just as keenly interested in the conditions of transformation that climate change creates or implies, as the kind of conditions of social reproduction that are always going to be with us. And, I'm still working on the paper. Daniel's seen a draft of the first half of it. So I don't have a kind of hard and fast answer to that question, but it's one that I'm trying to write about now.
Great. So we have a number of questions coming through. I'm going to have to paraphrase some of them. So apologies for those in the audience who have written longer questions. But I have a question from Devin Lee, who asks for a bit of an update about the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, and Risk Rating 2.0. What has happened to these discussions, and what is fair? These discussions of what is fair price to pay and a policyholder paying proportional to their means. I think the gist of the question is really kind of bring us up to date and talk us through kind of where things are going.
Yeah, so, FEMA has been criticized for many, many years about how it maps and prices risk. And this is in some ways a response to decades of criticism. But what they've announced is that they are going to start a new form of insurance rating, which is not so premised on these maps, but is instead an individualized assessment of your risk that incorporates more kinds of flood events. So not just the 100-year storm, or 100-year flood, but more kind of frequencies of flood events, includes the kind of cost of rebuilding a particular house, includes your specific distance to the flooding, the flood source. And on the website, where they talk about this change, they describe this as a fairer way to price insurance, which of course, smuggles in a whole lot of ideas about what causes flood risk and what you can do to control it. And what's also really interesting about that is that they specifically say that they're trying to incorporate kind of state-of-the-art private industry practice. So the state picked up this risk because the private market didn't want it. Was not interested in underwriting flood risk for many, many decades. That's why we have a national flood insurance program. And now the program is trying to kind of emulate the distance that private insurers have traveled in the ways that they assess and price risk. And so it's trying to kind of run more like a private program. This is stuff that they've announced. They're going to announce the rates in April. The rates are meant to go into effect in October. The history of the program in some ways could be told as a story about announcing rate increases and having them walked back or moderated in some form or fashion. So I'm somewhat skeptical that what they plan is what we'll actually see. But that's kind of where things lie. And in the meantime, this is a program that's meant to be reauthorized by Congress every 5 years. It's kind of exceeded its expiration date on a handful of occasions. They've had to kind of emergency reauthorize it. And so there hasn't been like a juncture for Congress to really take another look, but that might be, in the not too distant future as well.
So we've got two questions here that I'm actually going to bring together because they do kind of connect. Now, one's from Joshua Rosenberg, who draws our attention to last week's climate events in Texas and the pervasive home destruction there due to pipes freezing, inadequate electrical infrastructure. So he says such cases don't necessarily fall under flood loss, right, but are climate provoked, climate related. So I guess he's asking us to think about climate insurance kind of more broadly beyond just flood insurance, and how do we account for climate destruction not necessarily provoked by flooding or related to flooding. So another question that I think connects to that is from Rebecca Hersher, who sort of changes or takes our lens from kind of coastal flooding to inland flooding, and wants us to think about whether climate-driven inland flooding and coastal flooding are substantially different in terms of what the losses look and feel like to those who experience them. So both kind of draw our attention to, again, sort of Eric's point about the materiality of disaster and of climate change, and kind of how we can think about those differences.
Great, thanks to both of you for those questions. Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited to say that there are people thinking about climate and insurance, not related to flood, but related to wind and kind of hurricane risk in Florida, work by folks like Zach Taylor and Ian Gray and Jessica Winkle and co-authors. I mean, really thinking about how this is a problem that is being channeled through insurance as a kind of financial mechanism in a variety of different ways. And a lot of the same kind of politics come up, even though the physical risks are distinct and the arrangements between public and private are different in each case. And then in terms of the kind of the question of differences in the experience of flooding, I mean, this is in some ways another challenge that the program has always faced, which is that there's a lot that a flood insurance program can't see when it maps every floodplain using the same set of zones, the same kind of threshold of flood event. It doesn't really see the difference between a riverine flood zone and a coastal flood zone, and perhaps more importantly for the NFIP, a rural or a suburban flood zone and an urban flood zone. Because the floods will hit those places in very different ways, and what it means to mitigate will be very different in those two different places. I mean, in places with a more kind of suburban landscape where you have detached houses, okay, then maybe you can think about structural changes where you would elevate the whole house. If you live in a row house in Red Hook, you have to elevate an entire block. You can't just pop your house up. And the program has not really been able to deal with that those differences very meaningfully. And so the kinds of simplifications, I think, which are always about making decision-making easier, right? They're simplified in order to make it possible to administer an entire nation's worth of flood risk. So on some level, they're necessary, but then they create these other sorts of complexities that come with the things that can't really be simplified.
Can I just add something that I think one of the virtues of Rebecca's book is that she has a really kind of active and fertile theoretical mind and is kind of hooking in her empirical object to a bunch of different perspectives, and she takes the kind of work of science studies pretty interesting. And one of the issues for flood insurance and for other kinds of insurance products that are based on priced out through actuarial science is that they were established for a world in which experts were given a certain amount of deference, and there was kind of a widespread respect for technical expertise. And those were institutionalized through agencies that had a certain level of authority based on their standing. And we live in a world today where experts don't have that same kind of authority. And communities are interested in producing their own knowledge, whether doing their own maps or technical assessments or providing reports on the ground, like how can you justify this flood map given these photographs of the way in which my neighborhood flooded at these times. And of course, our political agencies lack a certain level of respect that might pacify, problems during crises or debates during crises. And so it's a fairly explosive area now where there are a lot of voices. And so kind of precisely how you do, you change the flood map and then how you extend it to things like extreme weather in Texas or fire in California and Colorado, all of that stuff is up for grabs. And so there's a lot more work to be done here, tracking these developments. And I think Rebecca's work opens up possibilities for research that are very exciting.
Great. So we're running out of time and have a few minutes left. And so I wanted to just paraphrase a few questions, put them out there since we won't really have time to address them. Might ask one final question and then give Rebecca kind of the floor to wrap us up. There were a few questions kind of asking about how we can use the book to understand things in sort of shifting scales, really. I mean, one was thinking about how sort of efforts to deal with climate change in the global north disproportionately or unjustly impact communities in the global south who might be facing problems around, say, mining or deforestation or perhaps even flooding as a result of certain kinds of technologies that are needed in the global north for more clean tech. Another question is specifically about kind of perceptions of risk and how they change with the political landscape, again, at different scales. So nationally, but regionally or at the state level or at the city level in the US. So those were kind of scale questions that I thought were interesting and worth mentioning. But the last question that I have here that I wanted to pose for Rebecca as a way of kind of closing us out, and this speaks to what many of our commentators have already admired in Rebecca's work, is the way that she uses interviews and uses people's kind of stories and narratives and real lives to understand what is often, seen as a more technical or more abstract problem. And so Amanda McMillan asks, could you speak more to how your interviewees understood the tension between staying in a risky and expensive place and moving elsewhere? So I thought you could sort of take us out with, again, turning it back to some of the ethnographic material in the book.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, maybe to kind of answer that last question first. I mean, the question of scale is a really interesting one. And actually, there's also really interesting work on the role that insurance is playing in governing. I mean, in some ways, the first experiments in climate insurance were undertaken in sub-Saharan Africa, and Lee Johnson's written about this, and in the Caribbean as well. Kevin Grove is doing some work on this as well. But yeah, I mean, I think in some ways what frustrated me about some of the kind of larger public conversation about what was taking place with all of that kind of contestation of flood insurance after Hurricane Sandy was this idea that, well, these people just don't understand. They don't understand the risk they face. If we could just communicate it to them better, they would understand and they would take the rational decision to do something about it. And that was not what I found. I mean, first of all, they just lived through a flood. I mean, very, very hard to dispute that you're at risk of flooding in that moment. But people were trying to kind of weigh up this question of, well, what am I meant to do now? And against kind of what timelines of expectations? Like, are we talking about something that I have to factor into next month's mortgage payment? Are we talking about when I want to sell the house in 5 years? Are we talking about, well, I'm just not going to expect that my kids are going to be able to inherit this because in 20 years it's not going to be livable? And that, I think, was really bewildering to people. And then a lot of what I heard, because I would say, well, what about people who say you should just move? And the question that often people would respond with is, where am I going to go? And actually, I saw a presentation by Jim Elliott as part of our social life of climate change at the LSE. We are not related. And he showed these maps where basically, like, no matter where you are in the US, you're dealing with some kind of serious natural hazard, fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods. You know, so I mean, if we think about that, then it's like, well, this is a project of making everyone safer from something. And you know, to say that this is just a problem of floodplain homeowners who need to kind of get out of the way, I think ignores, you know, that larger context and the bigger problem that we have to contend with, which is, you know,